There is one card in Yu-Gi-Oh! That if any player uses with pretty much zero setup required, the game will essentially end on the spot once it's allowed to resolve. It is probably the single most powerful card that is still legal in all of the different formats: OCG, TCG, and Master Duel. And yes, with TCG legal, that means I'm not talking about Maxi. Although that card is also kind of ridiculous. If you haven't already guessed the card, it is none other than TCG's newly limited That Grass Looks Greener. I've already talked about this card a bit on the channel, but it was such an integral part to my World Championship lineup that I didn't want to talk about it too much until after the fact, and I figured now would be a good time to focus solely on That Grass as well as the overall deck that I ended up using. So I'll have it on screen here. Now, obviously, this deck is built for Master Duel and with the World Championship format in mind, but the concepts here can be applied across several different formats, and that's what I want to get across with this video. And before I move on to the actual bulk of the topic, if you enjoy these discussion videos where we go over the format, single text, decks, or more overarching concepts within Yu-Gi-Oh! Itself and analyze them to a finer degree, then let me know. Leave a like, subscribe, and comment down below what other topics you think may be worth the deep dive, because I know there's almost an endless amount of discussions that can be made when you want to get nitpicky in this game. Now, there is no feeling quite as riveting as the power you wield when you resolve grass for 20 plus cards. And then pretty much any deck that would run this card, the game should be unlosable at that point. That includes when you stare down the otherwise daunting field of like Unchained Soul of Rage with the Unchained Escape Trap card, plus Phantom Yubel and DDD Wave King High Caesar. All of those things you could probably beat if you resolve just grass alone. The raw amount of engine that 20 card mills can generate is typically enough to churn through a board of 5 more negates. I mean, that's an arbitrary number, but in experience, I really haven't had a problem beating any field once I've resolved this card. But grass is a limited card, and in order for this card to have a payoff, you're going to play a 60 card deck. Asterisk, we'll get to that later. So in theory, this card is just the biggest gamble of all time. You only have an 8.33% chance of drawing it when you go first in 60 cards, and you only have a 10% chance to draw it when you go second in 60 cards. So it would seemingly be bold to allow your deck building to be dictated by this card alone. But like most things in Yu-Gi-Oh!, it's not that simple. The overarching concept for my World Championship winning tournament deck was that with the aid of Left Arm Offering, I'd have access to 4 copies of grass when I start, and then with Triple Tactics Thrust, I'd have 7 copies when I went second. That would give me a 30% chance when I start and a 54.14% chance when I went second. Because think about this as well, we are going to have to look at grass's context. What decks would be using this card? So we should assume we're using a pretty engine-intensive deck. Something like Chalamet is the prime example, but not the only one. Its high number of engine means that most hand traps are rather ineffective. And this is even more true in the TCG, where you can't get bogged down by Maxi, the card that kind of puts 60 card decks a little bit in its place when it comes to Master Duel. Because when it comes to cards like Ash Blossom, Effect Veiler, Impermanence, and Nibiru, even without grass, a lot of the time these high engine decks can push through those without real issues. And the biggest flaw with these decks is oftentimes they can struggle going second. And without having the space to play a large suite of hand traps, you force to play board breakers and therefore have to watch your opponent make the board. You cannot stop it. And even if you wanted to play hand traps, the ratio you'd be able to play would not be sufficient to keep up against decks like Yubel or Snake Eye, which can play through a hand trap or even 2 rather consistently. So with grass, these types of decks can add 7 bombs alongside the other cards that are already really good going second, like Dark Lunamore and Droplet, to make a combo deck like Tier have a lot higher of a chance to win going second. And while you can argue that there are other board breakers that exist, cards like Triple Tactics Talents or Change of Heart, Snatch Deal, cards that would otherwise fill the role of board breaker, lack the same level of potency that the cards I mentioned earlier, like Dark Whirler and Droplet, have, and really won't get your engine going the same way that, grass does. It also has the added benefit of these cards acting as both engine and non-engine in a way, like I'm classifying them here with the non-engine cards, but in reality, they are engine. So that means you don't have to risk bricking on cards like Left Arm and Grass. Thrust is a different story. Thrust will be a bit prone to bricking when you start. As you can see in my World Championship Finals match against Josh, I had 2 of them in my hand and went Medora Pass. And while that type of game may look pretty sad and depressing, like how can this be a top tier deck, You then get the polar opposite, where we can go and look at the game literally before that versus Emirate in the finals, where through 2 Bestials, Ghost Ogre, and the Phalanx, I'm able to relatively easily push through, and largely that is because of that grassless screener and left arm offering. I was able to force out all the interruptions before finally resolving grass, and that let me get to the point of the game where I can stabilize, do my combos, and get into the grind. At that point, the game is not over yet. I still have to actually kind of maneuver it properly, but in all senses, it was my game to lose. I had the resources at my disposal. I was the one in the driver's seat. I just had to execute it all properly. And the fact that this deck could almost effortlessly push through fields and even cards that were good against you like Bestials and come out on top was a large reason that I was drawn to this type of deck, especially when only one player could play the best deck of the format, which was Fire King. Now, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. Fire King Snake Eye is still the better deck in National compared to Tier Elements, but when you had to play something else, this deck ended up being a high performer. Very few decks could reasonably push through these full fields and keep up. And then on the same front, also go first and still execute very effective wins. We saw several times I'd win the roll, and the game was just unwinnable for my opponent. Over the course of testing, there were many games where I would play through full fields, even without grass, and that makes this deck very compelling to play, these high engine count decks. And now that you have way more get out of jail free cards in grass, left arm, and thrust, your win rate should go up by pretty solid margins, to the point where I can comfortably call this a meta sort of strategy. Also, with all that in mind, this isn't confined to just tier, because the winning element in a lot of these cases is the grass. And I didn't get to use it at Macho Worlds because I never resolved thrust a single times, but I did draw left arm a few times, and when I did, that card was pretty solid. You could be applying this to other decks as well, such as Infernoid or Yugioh, something I want to try it in. Brandon's an obvious one we see in Master Duel as well, and I think that these are all things we can kind of try and incorporate in the future as we keep testing new things in the TCG. Now, one thing I do want to address with this deck is that at the World Championship, I did brick a few times and I wasn't able to play. And you could argue that partially this is because of the number of bricks that I include in my deck in order to make the grass and high engine count decks kind of work, as well as having to play cards like Thrust, which directly contributed to me not being able to play when I won the roll against Josh. And the thing is, you are sacrificing a bit of consistency here, but in return, you get to play through hand chest more often when you do draw playable, and you also get to play through fields when you go second. So you're trading off your win percentage a bit when you go first, equalizing it a bit more in other scenarios. And I feel like overall, it ends up trending the deck's win rate upwards, which is something people have to understand as you play a deck that can sometimes just brick. But I do think that it is a very viable direction for a lot of decks to go when you're pushing this very heavy engine combo break fields type of approach. Now, there is one other thing to this whole type of strategy that is going to be very important if this is something you plan on playing or incorporating into the TCG. And it's a big asterisk because as this meta is somewhat unsolved, it's something that could be a pain in the ass down the line if the format shapes up in a certain way. And what I'm talking about here is part of the reason why this performed so well for me at the World Championship is that the main decks, Yugioh and Fire King, were setting up Monster of Negates, Appaloosa, cards that really shine against Tier Elements and other engine-heavy decks. And then alongside that were a bunch of removal pieces. Or if there were any other negates, it was stuff like Phantom Yugioh or Fire King Arvada, both of which are also not spell and trap negates. And what that meant was basically grass could go almost unchecked. The only card that would beat it would be Ash Blossom, a card that is not searchable. So it wasn't like I had to bait out any interruptions to get grass going. If I drew grass, there is a very real chance I could just play it first card and it'll be the card that ends the game immediately. Now, in a format where Omni Negates are present, this no longer becomes that viable, because now once you have to start pairing cards together, looking at those odds of 50% then you have to add the other requirements on top, and becomes less desirable. So what I'm specifically looking at in the TCG is if Desiree is going to be a huge end piece. I think there's a chance it may not be. For example, Fiendsmith decks may fall out a bit as they lose a lot of their versatility with Beatrice, but also because what a lot of Fiendsmith may want to be doing is making DDD Wave King High Caesar early, because what that accomplishes with the Necroquip combo is that you won't lose to Nibiru. And if that's what people do and they phase Desiree out of their deck a bit, which I think it could happen, then this type of strategy seems very viable. Now, that's not to say there aren't any other Omni Negates in the format. If Yubel becomes this very omnipresent threat and Varudras is in the meta, then, well, that hurts, right? That's something you're going to have a problem playing against. That's not something I had to contend against when I played in Master Duel. So I do think this type of strategy, this type of deck building, where you put a very high engine count deck in, put these 7 copies of grass in, have a lot of graveyard effects, and then just fill in the suite of the only really powerful non-engine left, gives you a deck that is really strong going first and has a very good fighting chance going second. Is a great way to start building decks when we are able to do so freely in a non-Omni Negate type meta. And even though that may not always be the case, I think it's important that we have that on our mind and we think about it, because anytime that type of situation kind of reappears, that's when we should play these decks like my tier deck. Yeah, I'm going to be testing a lot of grass decks in the TCG over the next few weeks on this channel. I think you guys wanted to see me do tier Lightsworns first, which I'm happy to do, but I also want to explore the more off-the-wall strategy like 60 card Yugioh. And I promise I will get all that to you guys in due time. I do need to kind of re-familiarize myself with the TCG, as I've been so heavily focused on Master Duel in the last month and a bit. But given that my attention is directly moved towards grass and this way of playing with the 7 copies, I felt like it was a perfect time to make an analysis on grass and how much it could actually have an impact on the metagame if we let it. Let me know what you guys think. Will grass shake up the metagame, especially with the upcoming YCSs in Lille and Santiago, and then Cancun the following week, all before Rage of the Abyss? Or do you think this will be a flop and grass decks will kind of be nowhere to be seen, with only a few high-roll lucky players edging their way in over the next few weeks? If I had to bet, I'd say we see a fair bit of grass, not dominance by any means, but more than just luck. So yeah, I'm curious what you guys think. But other than that, I'll see you all next time. Peace.